Thank you. Thanks, Leah. Appreciate it. And thanks, Charlie, and thanks, museum here. This is wonderful. Lord. I don't know how many of you grew up with brothers, but my younger brother was. We always got along great as long as he did what I told him to. He's an attorney in Southern California, and that's 2 years younger. I was on the phone with him earlier today because he's got to teach a gospel doctrine lesson. Thought I could help him with on some history of Zion's camp. Anyway, the Wright brothers are fun because they grew up in a home with two very positive, supporting parents. Their father was a bishop and supported their ideas. He wasn't that mechanically minded, but he was a very religious person and passed that on, their belief system. And their mother was the mathematician. She was very strong in the sciences, and she encouraged her boys to get a knowledge of science and so on. You know, brothers don't always agree, and I think that may be an understatement for many. But you know, when they do agree, as I look back on my own relationship with my brother that was had another younger brother that was 12 years younger, but he's passed away now, and he was too much younger to be part of what I'm talking about with my 2-year younger brother. We miss him a lot, but anyway, great brother. But you know, when we disagreed, we really disagreed, and when we agreed, we actually could accomplish something. And that's when I look back on it, I remember we missed my brother and I missed a scout event that we were invited to join a close neighbor ward to go down to southern Utah, and there was a terrific accident on that trip. And I don't know if you remember, it was back in about 1963, and I think there were like 15 boys killed. And big truck, the brakes went out on it, and it was an international truck going up an incline. And anyway, a bunch of them were killed, the scoutmaster and so on. And my brother and I that day decided we didn't want to go, we wanted to climb Y Mountain. It's one of the few times we agreed that we didn't want to go on it. We usually were pretty good scouters, but it wasn't our troop. We were being invited to it, but I lost some friends on that. It was kind of sad. But we decided to climb Y Mountain, and we actually made it on that trip, working together on it. But a lot of times brothers don't work together, and the opposite effect takes place. It's interesting on Wilbur and Orville, both interesting, odd names, aren't they? They were known as Will and Orv. But they actually had different names for themselves. But at any rate, they were usually just called the bishop's sons as they were growing up. And it was when they were quite young, in 1878, their father brought home this helicopter toy. And it had a rubber band on it to make it fly. It's made out of cork and light paper and wood, and the boys were fascinated by this. Their father let it go in their living room, and according to them, it flew up to the ceiling and then gradually came down. And that one little incident sparked an interest in these two brothers. Why can't we get something to fly? And pretty amazing how little things like that can start. At any rate, they grew up in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton, Ohio is also the home for John Glenn later, and Ohio was the state of Ohio was the ground base of Neil Armstrong. So it's interesting how a lot of the people in aeronautics in our country's history started out in Ohio for some reason. But at any rate, the Wright brothers were raised and lived most of their lives in Dayton. There were a couple years in Indiana, but mostly it was in Ohio. And neither one of them ever married. Neither one of them ever graduated from high school or got a diploma, I should say. Wilbur should have got it, but they moved from a town in Indiana back to Dayton before he got it. So neither boy graduated from high school technically. Neither boy was ever married. In fact, Wilbur made this statement, look, I could either invent the airplane or be married. Because I didn't have time for both. But neither boy did. And their arguments, they could work together very well, but their arguments were sometimes very heated, as you can imagine, among brothers. Even though there was, Orville was the kid brother, he was 4 years younger, but they were almost like twins in some ways in the way they thought. And the arguments, many times, people noticed in the family would end up with Orville taking one position, Wilbur taking another position, and then by the time the argument was concluded, they'd taken each other's positions. And if you think about that, that's one way to get problems solved. And because of that unique relationship these two boys had, they were a little like Mutt and Jeff. They were real close. And they got along actually very well. And they agreed with one another on many things. The disagreements usually always ended in discussions in which they did ultimately agree, and they usually came around to each other's position, which is kind of interesting. Well, we know that due to the toss of a coin, that Orville was the first brother to be airborne in the first heavier-than-air control flight. And they believed in photography, so this is a photograph of the first flight, his famous photo. If you look at this one, Orville has signed it right here. He signed it usually the way he's laying on the plane. This is Wilbur running beside him here. Wilbur actually won the first toss on this. I'm jumping ahead of myself just to talk about these artifacts a little. But Wilbur's flight didn't get off the ground, so they flipped again, and Orville won. And so Orville got the flight that went 120 feet, which was the first controlled heavy-in-air flight in history. Now, people have been trying to fly since Icarus, and the ancients would jump off cliffs trying to pretend like there were birds, and many of them would die, like some birds do. But it was really these guys that came up with their breakthrough invention was their creation of a 3-axis control system, which enabled the pilot to steer the aircraft effectively and to maintain its equilibrium. Their system of aircraft controls made fixed-wing power flight possible and remains the standard in aviation of all kinds. Their first U.S. patent did not claim invention of a flying machine, but rather a system of aerodynamic control that manipulated a flying machine's surfaces. And it was during the time that Orville had kind of dropped out of school, and the two of them decided to build a printing press and to publish a newspaper. And so that was their first big real endeavor that they did. In fact, the paper was called the West Side News, and they not only put out a paper, they invented their printing presses. So they were very mechanically, they could think through things. And ultimately, they created in 1892, they opened a bicycle repair shop in Dayton, Ohio. They designed, bicycles were really hot then. Any of you that remember, we just lost Robert Redford, but his Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, when the bicycle was introduced in the 1890s, it became an important invention at that time. So in 1892, these brothers opened a bicycle repair shop to capitalize on the national bicycle craze that was going on. They designed their own bicycle. They'd already made press for the newspaper. And their bicycle had custom features like an oil-retaining wheel hub and coaster brakes. Things still used today in many modern bikes, but they invented those. Their bicycle business financed their work on inventing the world's first controlled flight. That's where their money came from. They didn't have bankers. They didn't have backers financially. Their first plane, the Kitty Hawk 1, the flyer, cost them $1,000, which was a lot of money back in then. But they came up with all the money themselves. They didn't borrow any money. They worked hard. They got their money off their bicycle business and their printing business before that. And the Wright brothers financed the plane entirely themselves. The framework was made of spruce with twin pusher propellers and a specially designed engine cast mainly from lightweight aluminum. It was the first controlled and powered flying machine that could fly with the weight of humans. And just to go on with the description here, from the beginning of their aeronautical work, Wilbur and Orville focused on developing a reliable method of pilot control, whereas most of the inventors out there were trying to invent a bigger engine to get up, but that wasn't the key to flying. And they had their own air tunnels, wind tunnels that they invented. They had many failures, and they started out with gliders. In fact, one of the rarest things that I have is this little piece. It's a French magazine that came out in 1902, a year before their first airplane flight. And it has the very first printed articles by Wilbur Wright here and here, including a picture of the Wright glider, which they were going to put up, okay? It's the only copy of this I've ever seen, but it's a real little magazine. And so they're getting known for their gliders, and that was mainly what they were into. The childhood inspiration of their father's little model helicopter sparked an obsession that these two boys couldn't give in on, even when they were working at their newspaper and working at their bike shop. Their ultimate dream was to be able to fly. And there were many other people in the world that were working on the same thing. Samuel Langley was the head of the Smithsonian. And he took credit for being the first pilot, which is the first flyer, which wasn't really true, but he had a lot of backing. The Smithsonian, he was a famous inventor. The Langley was the first aircraft carrier. Langley Field is named after him still today. And because of the fact that he wouldn't recognize the Wrights, Orville sent the original Wright flyer, the Kitty Hawk, to England, where it was on display for years, before finally, after Langley's death, the Smithsonian said, no, the Wright brothers were the first. And so Orville had it sent back. He didn't live long enough to see it in the museum, but he had it sent back shortly before his death. And those of you that have been there, have you seen it, the Wright flyer? Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Well, the Wright flyer only lasted that one day. It was December 17th, 1903, when they got the thing off the ground. They made 4 flights that day. The first one didn't go anywhere, but to speak of, it didn't get off the little track that they had, the one wheel that it was going to go off on. The second one, like I say, was 120 feet, and Orville won the toss on that, so he became the first flyer to make the first heavier than air controlled, is the word, flight. And then there were 2 more, and Wilbur had the longest flight of the day, 852 feet, and the plane basically crashed at the end of it and was not usable anymore. So they boxed it up and shipped it back to Dayton, Ohio from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And it stayed in the box until it went on display later in England, and then at the Smithsonian when they had to take the linen off of it because the linen, a lot of it had fallen apart. This is a piece of the linen here, and so you can see what that is. And the Wright family later gave out pieces of this to friends and so on when they had to redo the linen for what you saw in the Smithsonian. But that's a piece of the original linen. It's interesting on aeronautics that we like getting a little piece of the plane. So I brought a piece of Amelia Earhart's plane over here, the Vega, the one she flew the Atlantic solo, first woman solo pilot. That was put out by the Smithsonian. They used that to raise funds to redo the Vega, to put new skin on it and everything. So that was actually put out by the Smithsonian as a fundraiser. And then there's I brought a little piece of Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, which is up in the upper right here of that little silver piece. Of course, all of these people only came about because of the Wright Brothers' achievement that they got us into the air, got us going. Their father was always scared that these brothers were going to die in the air. And every time they went up, there was always that chance that they'd join many of the other attempted flyers that died over the years. Many of them had. Otto Lilienthal had died. He was a great German that tried to pilot one of the early planes. And he died, and that was one of the inspirations they had for wanting to fulfill the dream that he'd had and their dream to fly. So the fathers promised the bishop, their dad, that they'd never fly together. And they only broke that promise one time. And their father was there at the time. But they told him that it was after they'd had some success. And it was 1910, so it was towards the end of the first period of flying. Wright brothers flew together just that one time. And the father made an single exception when they'd had so many successes. They'd had a couple of failures too. But on May 25th, 1910, allowed the brothers to share a 6-minute flight near Dayton with Orville piloting and Wilbur the passenger. After the Kitty Hawk 3, they redesigned it to have a place for a passenger and for a pilot. So it had 2 seats that sat upright by the Model 3. At any rate, after landing safely, Orville took his 82-year-old father on his first and only flight. As Orville gained elevation, his excited father cried out, "Higher, Orville, higher!" His dad survived the flight too, so they survived that legacy. Well, like I say, the Wright Flyer of 1903 was destroyed, basically put in a box and put away, not until museum time. There was a tragedy early on that occurred. It seemed like almost immediately they were looking for an audience or for a customer base, because they couldn't go much further with development without getting some money. And they could only go so far financing it themselves. And so they looked to the military. And this is about a decade before World War I. And in 1908, while Wilbur went to France, to where he published this years before, and was teaching people how to fly. Wright Flyer, I don't remember which model he took with him. It was probably a 3 or whatever, a 5. But any rate, he was teaching, and he had great success, Wilbur, in teaching the French, mostly the French pilots and so on to fly. Somewhere I've got a photograph of a French pilot. I wasn't able to find it, that he signed on a Wright Flyer photo, where he was very proud of having passed Wilbur's test, becoming a pilot, one of the early ones in France. While he was over there, Wilbur was running the business here in the States, and they both decided that Wilbur was probably the better pilot, that Orville was probably the better pilot, but Wilbur actually had more positive business, like I say, in France and Europe. But Orville got an agreement with building a Wright military flyer for the U.S. Army. And in 1908, there was a famous Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, who Glenn Curtis, another famous pilot that they were competing with, had been a close friend of, and this Thomas Selfridge was kind of the military's arm to look at aviation for the military. And Orville took to the air for a demonstration flight at Fort Myer, Virginia, with this Army Signal Corps Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge as a passenger. Just a few minutes into the flight, and the propeller fell apart, disintegrated. The aircraft spiraled out of control and smashed into the ground at full speed. Rescuers pulled an unconscious Selfridge from the wreckage, and the lieutenant died a few hours later. That was the first air fatality, since the invention of the airplane. And Orville, I should say, broke 4 ribs and broke some bones on his back and suffered for the rest of his life. He was in hospital for months, but survived it. He broke a leg too, 4 broken ribs and a back injury. Impaired him for the rest of his life. Well, the real tragedy that took place, because they were really starting to take off. One of the rare little artifacts that I brought today. This is the only flyer I've ever seen from the Wright Flying Company when they were in business, and not much, but it's a rare little piece, and it's advertising Wright flyers. You open it up. It came out in 1910, I believe. And of course, it's got the beginning of flying with, the first photograph there. And then it proceeds to tell, it's got the names of the people in the company, and it's got their latest, priced at $5,000. Just this bigger 39-foot wingspan Wright flyer. I think this is the 5, as I recall, the Wright flyer. They called it a Model B here, so, but I think we call it the 5th one. Anyway, it was this came out actually in 1912. I'm sorry, the day that they advertised their School of Aviation, the Wright School of Aviation there in Dayton, and they noticed that their patents were sustained. Unfortunately, the Wright brothers spent most of their time from their first flight trying to convince the patent office that they're the first. Because you got Langley, you got Curtis, you got others that claimed they were the first. And ultimately, the patent office had to determine that, and it took till 1906, 3 years after the first flight, or 2.5, for the Wright brothers to get the first patent, which was not on flying, like I say, but on the mechanism of flying. At any rate, the tuition for the school, incidentally, they had at $300, and that's been marked out $250 to be, which was a lot of money back in 1912. And here's I don't know if you can see this picture of their hangar. That's a very early hangar with their plane in it. At any rate, some of their graduates, their number one graduate was Lieutenant H.H. Arnold, later 5-star general in the Army Air Corps during World War II. So they trained some of America's first pilots, first flyers. Amazing people. Now, I brought a couple other things here just to show you. I mentioned the Lindbergh over here. If you look at the lower left, the piece up front is a little piece of the plane, the silver piece, when they had to redo it for the Smithsonian for the Spirit of St. Louis. But and it was built by the Ryan Aircraft down in San Diego before he took off in 1927, May of 1927, across the Atlantic. Lucky Lindy, they called him. Changed the world for somebody to fly the Atlantic, but this again is 24 years after. But he was still one of the real pioneers. And then the little note was written out and signed, typed and signed in Salt Lake when he brought out here. I've got some photographs of him at the Salt Lake Airport, 1927, which consisted of two barns, the Salt Lake Airport, and it looked like the runway was clay or something. But anyway, you can see 100 people around this tall, skinny guy moving his own plane around. So, even from 1927, things have changed quite a bit. And then, as I mentioned, Amelia Earhart over here, and of course her last flight, we don't know what happened to her. They're still thinking they may have found her plane, who knows, but it's still up in the air. I brought a couple of other things that are kind of interesting in early aeronautics. I don't know if you can see this aeronautics editor's 1907 letter from London, where he's having fun flying around the page. Okay, so that's early aeronautics, 1907. And then I brought a barnstormer. A famous barnstormer was Roscoe Turner. This is Roscoe's plane. And he made 3 successful transcontinental flights back in the early 30s. And there's a letter of his here. And I brought this guy, Earl Ovington's. This is a signed photo of Earl Ovington here, because in 1911, Earl was an American aeronautical engineer, aviator, inventor, served as a lab assistant to Thomas Edison. And Ovington piloted the first official airmail flight in the United States in a Berloy 11, French-made plane, September 23rd, 1911. He carried a sack of mail from Nassau Aerodrome in Garden City, New York, to Mineola, New York. He circled at 500 feet, tossed the bag over the side of the cockpit, and the sack burst on impact, scattering letters and postcards, which amounted to 640 letters they picked up and 1,280 postcards, including a letter to himself from the United States Post Office Department designating him as, quote, official airmail pilot number 1. So here Earl proudly signs the picture of him and his Berlot that he made that first airmail flight. And then I brought a letter of Jimmy Doolittle. And we remember Jimmy Doolittle from 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, but he was a famous early pilot, barnstormer and pilot in the early days, and shouldn't be forgotten. Doolittle was one of the great Americans, and his 30 Seconds Over Tokyo flight was a suicide mission. Many of you may have read about. In fact, I think they used the Langley for that, didn't they, as I recall? But at any rate, off one of the early aircraft carriers. And they knew that they didn't have enough fuel to return. So these guys, and the only reason for the 30 seconds over Tokyo during the Second World War was to tell the Japanese that we're responding to Pearl Harbor. And that was the reason for it. It's very interesting on that mission, too, that we had a spy a few years before that I might want to do one of these on, who actually was a famous baseball player. And there was a book called The Catcher Was a Spy, Mo Berg. And Mo was a law school graduate from Columbia. He spoke 8 languages. Brilliant guy. And he wanted to become a professional baseball player. Nothing to do with the law. And so he did. And in 1934, when Babe Ruth assembled a team to introduce baseball to Japan, of course they took Babe and Lou Gehrig, but they took Moe Berg as the catcher because he was a professional catcher. But he wasn't the best catcher, but he was a professional catcher. And in fact, Casey Stengel, if you remember him from the Yankees, my favorite team, later said that Moe Berg was the strangest guy he ever knew to play baseball. And that's because he was a spy. And so the government sent him with the team as a catcher because they were already having rumbles about Japan's invading Manchuria and so on in the 30s. And so when he wasn't catching for the team and showing the Japanese how to play baseball, he was filming. And they gave him some of the first color motion picture film, and he actually filmed the sites that were later used by Doolittle's raiders to attack the industries and so on there. Well, that's a little off base, but it's interesting how so many of these stories kind of come together in American history. And that was another one. Well, getting back to the Wright brothers, they're favorites. We could talk about them all day, but I think one of the great things about them is that the influence, when it was finally settled that they were the ones that had made the first flight, and that went on for many years. In fact, Glenn Curtiss was given credit for being the first pilot for quite a number of years, and Lynn Langley tried to take credit for being the first. Everybody wanted to be the first to fly. But it turned out that because the Wright brothers had documented everything, they had a photographer and everything, that their flight was the earliest. And we're talking about earliest controlled flight. There were a lot of people who were flying that couldn't control anything. And so the Wright brothers' invention was controlled flight, which was what we have today. And it stemmed from that. It's interesting, too, that Neil Armstrong carried a piece of the Wright Flyer with him, like this, to the moon. He also took a piece of the propeller to the moon. When he walked on the moon, it was in his PK kit. When he walked on the moon, he had two pieces of Wright Brothers 1903 Flyer. And Ohio and North Carolina continue to feud over their legacy, of which is actually the birthplace of aviation. Because these guys were from Ohio, but the first flight was in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, which is a real out-of-the-way place. If any of you have been to Kitty Hawk, it's really out of the way. They wanted to keep it secret and so on, and they enabled to do that. They sent after this successful flight, they sent a message, Western Union, back to their dad saying, "We've done it," and nobody believed them. So it took them probably a couple decades before things caught up. And like I say, the Smithsonian took their leaders, St. Langley's, word that he was the first. And so Orville was so mad that he just sent the plane off to England, put it up there for decades before it was brought back. Another interesting thing about them is that a little piece of the Wright Flyer was sent to Mars in 2021. So we're still sending pieces of it out there. I think one of the saddest things in the Wright brothers took place the year that Wilbur Wright signed this letter, 1912. This is dated February 3rd, 1912. May 30th, he died of typhoid. And his brother always felt that it was because of the patent war that was going on with Glenn Curtiss over who had invented the first controlled flight. And so he always, when they won their ability to control all of the other inventions of airlines around through their patents, through the patent office, he made sure that Glenn Curtiss did not get the right to build anymore, which was kind of sad because the American aeronautics industry was way behind Europe at the time 1918 hit, and we had to join the war that had been going on for 4 years in Europe, World War I. And finally, the U.S. government the Army brought Wilbur, or Orville in. Wilbur died. Brought Orville in, and Glenn Curtiss. And Glenn Curtiss was building a lot more planes, but he didn't have he was having to do it outside the patent. It would have been granted to the Wrights. And the government, U.S. Army Air, brought them two of them together at the beginning of our involvement in World War I, 1917, and said, you two, the government's going to take charge of this industry, and you're both going to make as many planes as you want. We need them. And so took off. It's interesting that later that the Wright Curtiss company became the big early company when they finally joined forces. It's also interesting that when Wilbur died, Orville basically walked away. He couldn't get over his brother's death, and that happens to people. They were very close. They'd worked through so many things and made so many achievements together. But when his brother died, Wilbur basically sold the business for $1.5 million and walked away another year after that, and never was involved with aeronautics again. He went back to his home and tinkered with other things, but that was pretty much it. Let me just see if there's something else here that I've missed. It was a fascinating lives. Yeah. I told you how Orville refused to donate the Wright Flyer for years, which was kind of sad. Incidentally, none of the Wright children, there was a sister's name was Catherine, were ever given a middle name. So that's just was a family thing. Wilbur and Orville, affectionately known as Will and Orv, but they refer to each other as Ullum and Bubs. The names the two brothers used for each other. It was Ullum and Bubs, and the town knew them as the Bishop's kids. Even though typhoid comes from the water, their father was constantly telling them to be careful of the air and be careful of the water. But, Wilbur died as a result of typhoid, and probably they say from consuming contaminated oysters. But at any rate, Orville never got over his death. They spent a lot of their early years just fighting for their patent from all these other people that were trying to come after them. In 1909, the Wrights were awarded the Congressional Medal for their contribution to the world with their flying machine. And I mentioned how Orville sold it off in 1915, a couple years after his brother died. In 1920, President Woodrow Wilson appointed Orville to the National Committee of Aeronautics. That was really his only aeronautic assignment after the death of his brother. The original Wright Flyer is in the Smithsonian, as you saw. The Wright number 3, which they think is more advanced because it had the 2 seats and could carry a passenger, is on display at the Wright Brothers National Museum in Dayton. Both brothers are buried at the Woodland Cemetery there. And the Wrights' home is open daily. Henry Ford tried to help supply Curtiss with money against the Wrights. But it's interesting that he's the one that ended up with the Wright Brothers bicycle shop is at Deerfield Village. I don't know how many of you have been there. It's a historical village that Henry Ford built at Dearborn, Michigan. I went there as a kid and it was kind of fun. He has the Lincoln's Law Office. He has the chair Lincoln was sitting in when he was shot, assassinated. It's in a case. And he's got the Wright Brothers bicycle shop there. There is a later bicycle shop that's still in Dayton, so there were 2 of them. And it's the only remaining building other than the home that remains there. they did a lot of, besides the Kill Devil Hills and the Kitty Hawk flu and so on, they did a lot of their testing on the Dayton Bankers field. Torrance Huffman was his name, and they utilized his pasture. So that pasture has been kind of dedicated as one of the original places. It's on the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but they continue to maintain it. Well, I think that's pretty much the main things I wanted to talk about. You know, it's interesting to me when you boil their lives down, how important it was that their dad gave them that little helicopter when they were little boys. And you wonder sometime about the influence of a parent. Their dad was not mechanical, the mother was, but he gave his boys this little toy helicopter, which inspired them to, if you think of how amazing flight is, human flight, I was listening to a historian today, a famous historian, talking about the Wright brothers, who said, you know, it's amazing that these guys were able to work through all the problems they had and in inventing heavier and air-controlled flight. It really is. It's an amazing thing. And it's amazing how far we've come. I remember when my grandmother was still around in her late 90s, thinking, as she told us about the Wright brothers, how she'd lived through that, and she remembered them. She didn't know them personally, but she remembered how flying started, and by the time she'd passed away, we'd already been on the moon, and a number of years, and I was thinking, man, it's just in her lifetime. When she was a little girl, her mother hid her under the table when the Indians came through Eden, Utah, where she grew up, and yet she lived into the space age. But then you look at our lifetimes, what we've been going through, and it's incredible, even in not only in aeronautics but in every subject, what gets created every year. Anyway, thank you for coming. Appreciate it.